Hey, Estelle. Hey, Lois.
Hey, Rabbi. Hi, Estelle.
Hi, Lois.
Okay. We are going to. Okay, so yesterday we started the actual mitzvot. We're in the positive commandments. Altogether, there's going to be 248 positive commandments. Yesterday, we just towards the end there, he quoted a Gaon whose name was Chafetz, who quoted an opinion which he was just astonished by. But it's sort of interesting, though, that he does give it attention, which is that there could be mitzvot that God is commanded. In other words, when it says that there are 613 mitzvot, some of these mitzvot are commandments for the Jewish people, and some of them are mitzvot for God. The examples he was giving are that there are sometimes where there are death penalties that God is initiating. So we are listing the death penalties that the court initiates. The Rambam said we count each death penalty as one positive commandment. He made the point that we don't count every mention of the application of the penalties as a separate commandment, but we do count each death penalty as a commandment. But there are some death penalties that are not done by the court. They are done by heaven or by God. And apparently they are listed in some works that talk about the mitzvot. So included in the 613 mitzvot, there are some lists of those 613 mitzvot that include death by heaven. So how would you explain that? So this Gaon, the Chafetz Gaon, or Gaon Chafetz, he suggests that there are mitzvot for man and there are mitzvot for God, and that including the 613 are certain mitzvot for God. Now, the Rambam just finds that just preposterous, this notion that amongst the 613 mitzvot are mitzvot that command God. But even if he considers that preposterous, it does bring up a notion, which is that God binds himself to act in a certain way based on our behavior. And that this isn't just true about the death penalties, this is true about blessings in general, that in his relationship with creation, and specifically in his relationship with man, choices of man bind God, as it were, especially if you think about what we call justice. After all, Abraham, in next week's Torah portion, is going to challenge God by saying it would not be God's justice to kill the righteous together with the wicked. It seems from Abraham that once God sets up this system, which is a system of justice, which he seems to want to teach man, he does want man to understand this system, the system of God's justice. He even says this about Abraham. He is going to teach his children the Derech Hashem, Lasos Tzedakah Umishpat. He's going to teach his children the way to go on the way of God, to do righteousness and justice. So it's not just that man might be able to figure out something of the workings of the universe, sort of like how we might figure out how gravity works or something. It doesn't seem to mean that. It seems to mean that this is important in the relationship between God and man, and that he wants us to understand how it works. He wants us to understand how justice works. It could be, I suggest it could be that this is even part of the reason for the Akedah, part of the reason for the binding of Yitzchak that follows this, is to sort of be a test as to how well Abraham is learning his lessons about God's justice, how justice works. But it does seem to be that God wants us not just to act justly, but he wants us to understand his justice, what his notion of justice. Now, justice requires a response. In other words, if man, let's assume man is using his free will, which we're told we have by the Torah, and he's making, he or she are making a choice based on their free will, God is going to respond in kind. So there is it's sort of thrown in God's court. So man is going to behave a certain way, then God is going to behave a certain way. Now, if we describe man's behavior, in other words, let's say man chooses to follow a command. So when man chooses to follow a command, we say he has done or she has done a mitzvah. That's how we characterize it. She has done or he has done a mitzvah. We have followed a command. You could say that the commands are the, so if, is it really inappropriate to say that when God is performing his part, that is it ridiculous to say that when he's performing his part, he is also in some sense doing a mitzvah? We're doing a mitzvah from our part, he's doing a mitzvah from his part. Is it ridiculous to say that I have not seen the text that the Rambam's referring to inside. I don't know the full expression of this idea. But if that's what he is suggesting, I agree that initially it sounds preposterous, but is that possible that when you unpack what's happening, that man does his part, then God does his part? And could it be that since this is sort of mandated by a system, that so that when we do our part, it's called a mitzvah. When he does his part, it's called a mitzvah.
But
yeah,
even if you don't want to say it's a full-fledged mitzvah, because mitzvah, then you think about punishments and rewards. Who's administering the punishment and rewards? But the thing, we have obligations to God. Does God have obligations to us? Now, for instance, Bachia in Chavos,
yeah.
So he says that God does have a responsibility, that he has a responsibility to feed us. And that until our dying day, God will make sure that in some way that we have enough to live. And he seems to regard it as a responsibility. Since he created us, this is a responsibility he has. I don't know whether his fulfilling it you want to describe as a mitzvah.
Well, the reason I feel like you could use the language of mitzvah in the other case is because that's how we characterize our part. mitzvah mitzvah means command, commandment, or in other words, something we are acting in a particular way because we're supposed to do it. Mitzvah means mitzvah without regard to reward. Mitzvah just means I'm following a command by God. That's what it seems to mean. I mean, that's what seems the word means. There's been a command, and I am obliged to follow through on the command. When I follow through on the command, I have performed a mitzvah. So if you say that there's now another part to it, which is once I've done my part, now there is a prescribed a kind of prescribed responsibility for God, because he's created the system where if we follow the command that we do our part, then he has to do his part. And if I characterize my part as mitzvah, would I be far-fetched to characterize his part as mitzvah? To me, it's different than the feeding thing. The feeding thing is just he made us in a way that we need food. It would be cruel, inhumane to create something that needs something and then not fulfill it, not provide it. It's more from deduction that God has this responsibility, but not when it comes to din. When it comes to the system of mishpat, let's say. So when it comes to the system of mishpat, and when we talk about God's justice, there it does seem like he's interested in us entering into a kind of prescribed system with him, wherein we do our part, then he does his part. And if I'm characterizing the fulfillment of my part as mitzvah, could it be that he also, obviously there's not another entity that is commanding it. He commanded it, but he commanded both sides of it. He commanded that we do one part, and then in a sense, part of that is that he do his part. So when he is subject to this system, would it be crazy to call it mitzvah?
Rabbi, I don't know if you call it mitzvah, but I remember thinking about this with Yirmiyahu. God wanted to perform, he said, I will be merciful to you, but I still have to punish you in some way. You are still going to be getting punishment because of what you've done. It was almost that God had a restriction on himself to do that justice.
Right.
And even if he didn't want to.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So, and there seems to be things like that with the golden calf and and the spies, that there is some restriction within the system. You might be able to give time for somebody to change their behavior, but there still might be, it's very hard to quantify exactly what needs to happen, how much suffering needs to happen, or how does it happen. But you do see that kind of expression in different places, that eventually, even with mercy, it doesn't mean that there is no judgment at all. It might just mean there's a kind of shifting in the way the judgment's carried out. But there doesn't seem to be a really carefully described system that we can understand for how that works. But I agree that you do see that a lot. You see that he feels bound by it, and it just the interaction between Abraham and God seems to suggest that he seems to be saying, like, you couldn't, or I don't know the difference between wouldn't and couldn't with God, but you wouldn't do that. And God says, you're right. And he seems, again, it's, if you look at the situation, he seems to be mentoring on this. He wants him to understand this, but that means, so when he, again, the Chafetz Gaon, as quoted by the Rambam, is suggesting he's the one who's using the word mitzvah. That's why I'm just sort of exploring it, that the Rambam is just like he's just exasperated by it, but he does quote it. And at the same time, that he says, I don't even know what to do with this thing. But I was just thinking that in some sense, because especially when it comes to punishments, and when it comes to punishments, he's, like you're saying, his hands are tied. But it's really, it would be the same thing with reward. If we do something good, he must reward us. So it seems like we are playing two sides, or two roles. One of us is doing the act, the other one is providing the response, the action and the reaction. So it's just, is it outlandish to characterize God's role as mitzvah as well, if ours is mitzvah? And again, at first blush, you would say the reason ours is mitzvah is because we've been commanded. He's a source of authority. We're obedient servants. The authority is commanding us to do something. That's how you typically think of tzivui. Tzivui is a command from an authority to somebody who is a subject. So we are the subject, he's the authority. So I mean, at first blush, you would say it's ridiculous to think of God as commanded. But once in this relationship, he's prescribed his behavior, then doesn't the same command, that the same source of command that makes us commanded, could it be said to make him commanded? Is it outlandish to say that in some sense he commands himself? Maybe you can't even say that. I don't know. Maybe you can't, because he isn't a subject. That might be part of the problem. He can't be a subject. But then how do you speak of him as prescribed at all? You're already making some kind of accommodation to think of God as prescribed to some system. Maybe it's just too far to go to think of him as commanded in any way, subject to something. Again, what else are you going to do? If you admit that he has to do it, a person did something wrong, now he has to be punished.
Now, in the case of man, there's always a chance that we may break the commandment. If you're looking at God as an analogy, and this is, of course, the cherry on top of the cake, is God capable of breaking his own commandment?
Does he have free will?
Does he have, if
he says,
change his mind?
He says, so we're slightly leaving what I was, this is an entire place to go. It's slightly leaving where we go, but it's related.
Yes.
But as long as we agree, we're not confusing this necessarily with the other thing, but because command doesn't necessarily require that the person has free will. But in our case, it is true that we have free will. It just would be, the question is, what would be what would be the point of commanding us if we don't have free will? But we do command things. We command dogs, for instance, and we don't think they have free will. So you could have commandment without free will, but the truth is we do have free will. So there are those who suggest that when God says, now man has become like us and knowing good and evil, right? Which the snake had also said that if you eat from the tree, you're going to be like God, knowing good and evil. That part of what it means is now man is able to exercise choice, his choice in the realm of good and evil, like we do. Now, God's choice, you could say, is when that man is free-willed and God is free-willed. Even also those people, there are some people who say that even in the creation, when it says, let us make man in our image, there are some who suggest that what is the key component that is like God? It's our free will. That God acts with his free will and we act with our free will. So, but what does it mean that God acts with his free will? Nothing compels him. It doesn't mean he's going to do something aberrant. It just means nothing compels him. Where, no outside, no outside cause directs him. So you would say something like that about our free will, and that's what it means. But I think I agree with you, and I think that there are two arguments made in Tanakh that suggest that God might in fact do that. One is on the side of mercy, which is from the book of Job, which we were talking about last night, and that not Job, Yonah, where God is essentially perhaps communicating to Yonah that there's some times where I act not according to the rules. The rules are that they should be punished, but there's sometimes when I act outside the rules, where I violate where I actually violate the rules of justice, and that would be on the side of Rachamim. And last week or 2 weeks ago, I was thinking that it could be the book of Job is arguing the other direction. That the last chapters of Job, where God is talking to Job, it could be that what he's setting up is the other side. In other words, I act in the book of Yonah, he's acting with kindness and mercy outside of the parameters of justice. And in the book of Job, he's saying, I act outside the parameters of justice when it comes to cruelty and punishment. That it's possible both ways. That there is a system, and if you follow the system, there are times when God is cruel and causes suffering, apparently cruel, and causes suffering outside the system of justice, and he's acknowledging that he's not sharing his reasoning. He's acknowledging, yes, I'm acting outside these bounds. If you had enough bandwidth, you would understand how it works. But yes, he seems to be acknowledging that. So you could say that the book of Yonah and the book of Job are representing God's admitting that he acts outside of the rules of strict justice, sometimes for mercy and sometimes with cruelty.
It seems like, most Leos would agree, because otherwise you're putting either compromises on God's freedom of choice or his freedom of action, either his omnipotence or his impeccability. So
right. So that would sort of respond to that question that people have about God being limited completely, that he doesn't seem to be. Now, it could be that at some more expansive level that there is some system that includes it. I don't know, but yeah, it could be those are where his expression of free will comes in, or at least two examples. When he's acting with mercy, there is no. Why doesn't he explain it in Jonah? The reason he doesn't explain it is because there's no systematic way to explain it. There is no systematic way to explain it. It is a violation of strict justice. Even the Midrash, which argues that it's necessary, doesn't say how it works. It just says man can't live just on justice. Man would not survive. So, but it doesn't explain how it would possibly work. Why? How does this thing even work? How does it not undermine everything if you respond in a way that's outside the system? That it doesn't explain, it just says it. So it seems to suggest that sometimes he will exercise it. Also, he uses this term, chen. He uses a term chen a couple times with Moshe on Sinai, like in when he's like in the Torah portion of Kisisa during that time when Moshe's asking him, "Show me your glory." So right before then, God had first said that he's going to lead the people from now on using an intermediary. There's going to be an angel that is now going to be direct contact for the Jewish people, and he's going to function as a sort of intermediary. The people immediately complain about that, and Moshe also registers a complaint, and God responds using that word chen. The word chen, Ramosha Shapiro emphasized this on more than one occasion. The word chen is, when you use the word chen, it means essentially, I'm doing this because I like you. It's not because you deserve it or I owe it to you. There's certain things that I do just because I like you. Now that concept, and he seems to be saying that to Moshe, okay, because you asked me and I like you, I'll do it directly. I'll remain directly in contact with you and the people. I won't put an angel in between. But if that's what it means, that I'm doing it because of chen, that again is not a systematic. How do you quantify that? It seems to be outside of any system. That seems, by definition, it seems to be a response that's also outside a system, a kind of natural justice system. I'll do it for you, even though I don't owe it to you, but I'll do it for you because I like you. So that could be another example, we could say, of where he's acting based on what we would call free will. In other words, he's not acting within some limitation of a system. I don't know. These are just things I'm thinking about. I haven't. They're not necessarily well tested. But there was something about his that idea of the Chafetz Gaon, as I'm understanding it from the way the Rambam quoted it, that sort of spurred that. And I like the fact that you're connecting it to that other question about God. Does God have free will ultimately to act outside of the system? Okie dokie. Yeah. So mitzvah number 1 was that you have to believe in the creator. You have to believe there was a beginning and that God is the first cause. Does he say the actual words? He says he is the cause of everything that came after. So I think that's the same thing as saying first cause. So he doesn't actually use the word creator in the Hebrew. He uses the word cause. He is the cause for everything that is in existence. He doesn't use the word borei necessarily.
What's the word for cause?
Siba. Now, again, this is a translation of his Arabic. Apparently, the Sefer HaMitzvos was written in Arabic. The codes are not written in Arabic, but apparently this book was written in Arabic and translated. But the word here is siba, and siba, I think, is rooted to the word like something that goes around, like sovev, maybe. It might be a related word to sovev. And so you have something going around. So this would be the thing that's causing it to go around, maybe. I don't know, but siba means a cause. Siba and of something. So that's the only word he uses. He doesn't use borei. He doesn't use the word creator. It just says we have to believe in God. There is someone who is a cause to everything that is in existence. Okay. All right. So commandment number 2. This is the command that he commanded us about belief in God's unity. Now, the Hebrew word is yichud. Yichud. That word, there's several options for that word yichud. It's usually translated as oneness, but it could, so sometimes they use yochid and one, and also miyuchad, unique. Sometimes there's like branches of this word that can sometimes mean one. They could sometimes mean unique. But usually it's translated as oneness. Here, which I don't know if it's different than the word unity. And that is that we believe that the power over existence and its first cause are one. So again, the Hebrew word for power over our existence, poel, the one who acts. Poel means somebody who acts. Poel hametzius, one who acts on existence and the first cause. So power over existence and its first cause are one. And that is so there is one source. The same being that is the first cause is also that being who acts or continues to act in existence. That seems to be what he's saying there. That we believe that the power over existence and its first cause are one, and that is his may be exalted. Hear Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And in many midrashic texts, you will find them saying, on condition that they unify my name, on condition that they unify me. That's also in intentions that you see before the mitzvah, before a mitzvah. They will say, liached et shmi, to unify my name, to unify my name. What does it mean to unify God's name? It means to bring together all the various facets that we recognize as God's input, and to unify them all and recognize that it is all in the same being. It's all in the same being. So whenever it says to unify God's name, that's what it means. To unify God's name means that all those various aspects that we associate with God are all from the same entity. They're all from the same entity.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
I don't know why this is popping in my mind, but I was listening to a lecture yesterday, and the lecturer was talking about the Greeks' relation to number. And they said that the Greeks actually believed that numbers began with 2. 1 wasn't included.
Seriously?
Yes. And what
That's
he said
fascinating.
was, he says, when you say, I have a number of pets, or I have a number of anything, you mean more than 1. So number means more, not 1. I just found that fascinating. So
yeah, that's interesting. Now, is that, I'd be interested in more facets of that, if there are more facets to that. If you find anything more about that, I'd be very interested in that.
I will. And it reminded me of how in Bereshit, the first day is Echad, but after that it's second, third, fourth. But the first isn't first, it's Echad. I don't know. All these things together.
Right.
Yeah.
That sounds very, I like that. Fascinating. Cool. Okay. And many like these. What they want with such a statement is that he indeed took us out of slavery and did the various kindness and benefits on condition that we believe in his unity, as we are obligated in this. So he took us out of slavery and acted with certain kindness towards us, but it was conditional on the fact that we believe in his unity. Okay. Al Tanai, yeah. In other words, his deal with this is, it sounds like he's saying here, the deal between God and us is, he does these acts for us, and we in turn are obliged to believe in his unity, which again might mean to know his unity, as we are obligated in this. And they often said the commandment of unification. That's how they identify it. Mitzvat yichud, the commandment of unification. So commandment of unification is to know that he is one. And I guess you would fulfill that by saying things like all of those things that happen to us from God are coming from one source. There is only one source. So, and if you suggested there was more than one God, then that would be a violation of this. Or maybe you would say, even if you said the words, you may call it one God, but if you mean that there are separate components to this one God, then you might also be in violation of it. Because that's not what we mean by one. We don't mean there are no separate pieces to it. It's not like a Godhead, like some kind of Godhead. It's one being. Out of a oneness, everything comes. And they also called it a commandment of the yoke of heaven. Ol Malchut Shemaim, the yoke of heaven, as they say, in order to accept upon themselves the yoke of heaven. It's one of the intentions before you say the Shema. So we call it the mitzvah to unify God, and we also say it is the mitzvah to accept the yoke of heaven. They apparently are two ways of saying the same thing. As they say, in order to accept upon himself the yoke of heaven, meaning acknowledgement of his unity and belief in it, which again might mean to know it, to know that God is one, absolutely one. So those are the intentions we say before saying the Shema. So we fulfill this mitzvah number 2, we fulfill it when we say the Shema. We do not fulfill mitzvah number 1 necessarily when we say the mitzvah of the Shema. Is there anything we do, any ritual that we do, that helps us fulfill mitzvah number 1? It could be when you, because the Mishnah says a person has to bless God for the bad, just like he blesses God for the good. But even that is it more of a mitzvah, a fulfillment of 2 than it is 1. You are acknowledging that God is the source of everything that happens. Is there a time when we acknowledge, I guess, Kiddush, when we do the mitzvah of Kiddush, we say God created the world. There, when we do the mitzvah of Kiddush, do we fulfill mitzvah number 1? Not sure. Mitzvah number 2 we fulfill when we say the Shema. Question is, when do we fulfill mitzvah number 1? All right, we will stop here. It is my plan that we should gather again on Monday and continue with mitzvah number 3 and maybe more discussion about mitzvah number 1 and 2.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. See you up.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.